This book is about one extraordinary Indian woman born in the 19th century, died a year after Indian independence and partition. Her story is also a story of her family, who were once Indian royalty, but forced by the British Raj to hand over power. They came to live in Britain, camping out at Buckingham Palace with Queen Victoria at one point. We'll hear much more of that. So far, it sounds like a story from the past, and it is. It's a fascinating sort of unrecorded history that you have pieced together and brought to life. But I think it's got a lot of contemporary relevance, particularly now, a week before the election. I think it's got huge contemporary relevance. There's the woman's story, the story of suffrage, but also the story of gender inequality in general. Women rising up, which is very much here in fourth wave feminism that we can talk to the panel about. There's also the immigrant story. However royal Sophia is, her family story is that of immigrant dispossession and trying to negotiate two cultural identities, which I found a really moving aspect of the book. There's international politics, struggle for Indian independence, the outrage felt against colonial rule, which is traced in the consciousnesses of Sophia's family members. The sense that the West is the occupier enrages some of them. It drives them to brave, irrational, sometimes radical acts, extreme acts.
Just a little bit about who she was and why it's significant, the choices that she made. Though she was doing her best to fade into the background, one face stood out among them all. I'll just give you a bit of a background about this. It's Black Friday, a notorious day in politics, and those of you who don't know about it ought to know about it, because it was a turning point in politics here. Emmeline Pankhurst and her suffragettes had been led to believe that the women would be given some kind of vote. A conciliation bill was going through Parliament, and they heard a rumour that Asquith, who had this pathological block when it came to women and the vote, was going to kill it. He was going to kill it in its crib. He was going to cut off the time it had to pass, and they all felt very betrayed. And so they met at a place not very far from Parliament, maybe about 5-6 minutes walk from Parliament. You can still see the building. It's called Caxton House. And they were going to march on Parliament, and they were going to bang down the door until Asquith came out and explained himself. So though she was doing her best to fade into the background, one face stood out among them all. It belonged to a quiet, bird-like woman seated right at the back of the stage. She was dressed in expensive Parisian couture, and her brown face stared back fiercely at those who stared at her. Princess Sophia Duleep Singh was as close to an international celebrity as it was possible to be in 1910. Many had been reading about her for years in the popular press. Daughter of a flamboyant Maharaja, goddaughter to Queen Victoria, champion dog breeder, resident of Hampton Court Palace. Fashion pages frequently declared her one of the best dressed women in the country, and shops would boast about her patronage. There were less desirable facets to Sophia's fame, however. She was the daughter of that man, the traitor, the one who lost everything. And whispers followed Sophia wherever she went. She was the Dark Princess, granddaughter of the greatest ruler the Punjab had ever known, the descendant of warriors.
I mean, I want to ask you, how Indian was she and how British was she? Because this is something that is difficult for her, you know, these identities.
Well, I mean, if you, I sort of touched on it in the little introduction that I did. She was the daughter of the last Maharaja of Punjab, a man who was so famous that he was close to Queen Victoria. He is commemorated, if any of you have been to Osborne House, you'll see a full-length portrait, a rather beautiful portrait by the court artist Winterhalter, which Queen Victoria had commissioned, which is painted in Buckingham Palace. So we're talking in that day and age of somebody who was extraordinarily famous. And the thing that set him apart, the thing that made him really very alluring as a celebrity, and I use that word sort of advisedly, he was a celebrity, turned up to parties that mattered and was seen with people that mattered, was that he was once the custodian of the Koh-i-Noor diamond, which many of you may have seen now in the Tower of London. So, you know, this mythical Maharaja who is known by everybody, the Indian in the court of Queen Victoria. And what happens is, you'd think then his daughter would be automatically granted that status of a celebrity, but something goes catastrophically wrong. He tries to take his throne back, And so everybody then has a second wave of cognizance of this family. The traitor, how dare he? You know, he's trying to raise an army up against the British. He's going to see the Tsar to try and get the Tsar to come and help side the British out of India. And suddenly the family is disgraced, you know, utterly disgraced. So they hide. I mean, Sophia's mother becomes an alcoholic. She can't stand the way that people hiss at her when she walks past. This woman who was welcomed and feted is suddenly the traitor's wife, the thief's wife. You know, they hiss at her when she goes past. And the family kind of implodes at that time. But then something happens. Queen Victoria is Sophia's godmother. And she decides to save her, to step in for her goddaughter. And she kind of puts her back together. She gives her tutors, she gives her guardians to look after her, she rebuilds her.
Yeah. Sorry, you found her diary. I'm utterly fascinated as to how you found it and how alive she became for you by reading that diary.
Well, her stuff is so there is a repository of papers at the British Library which is just called Duleep Singh Papers, and I just decided to read all of them, and suddenly out plopped, and nobody had read it for, you know, I don't think since it had come, one of the librarians had said, was a diary written by Sophia. And it actually, it talks about that moment when she turned from being, I mean, one thing I should say is after she's saved by Queen Victoria, she turns into my worst nightmare. She turns into a very pointless socialite, a little bit like her father. You know, the press call her a thoroughly English gal, notwithstanding her great Oriental name.
But those are her wilderness years, aren't they?
They
Before
are.
She, yeah.
But this diary catalogues what turned her into a revolutionary, and it's her trip to India, and it's meeting Indian nationalists,
Yes.
which suddenly brings her alive.
In 1907, she goes to India, doesn't she?
She does. I mean, she has her first trip to India against all the rules. She's not allowed to go to India. The British absolutely don't want the traitors' children going to India.
Causing trouble.
Yes, yeah. The Punjab, the north of India, is already bubbling with insurrection. It is the least governable, the most wild part of the empire. And the last thing they want is a Duleep Singh turning up and being this totem for rebellion. But the boys don't even try. The girls manage to go. So they go in 1900 and they see the Delhi Darbar, which was the great, huge celebration for Edward VII when he comes to the throne. He doesn't bother to turn up, but everybody else does. And it's a fantastic, huge party. And Sophia and her sisters sneak in. And what happens is she suddenly realises that in London, she is this great lady. She's this kind of Princess Diana character. Yeah. When she goes to India in 1900, she is treated no better than a coolie by the British there. They don't allow her to come to the Darbar. She's not allowed a corner of canvas in the Punjab camp to watch the celebrations. She is shunned. So she suddenly realises that actually, you know, the immigrant, feeling of being the other suddenly hits her in the face. And she goes back to England and suddenly the parties aren't enough. The high society, she doesn't trust it anymore. And it's the start of her change. And then 1907, where the diary is catalogued, is when she becomes fully politicised. That feeling of not belonging, that sense of I don't know who I am, or this doesn't fit anymore, these clothes don't fit me anymore. She suddenly finds her armour in 1907, things to swap, this uncomfortable clothing that doesn't fit her anymore. And she mixes with nationalists, and she hears their cry. They keep shouting in Punjab. It's a phrase, Awaz do, Awaz do, give us a voice, give us a voice, give us a voice. They're shouting, give us some sense that we control our own destiny. And she comes back to England, and she hears the same cry, give us a voice, coming from the suffragettes. And suddenly she's found her reason. She's found where she fits, and that's where she fits.
I wondered why Sophia didn't become embroiled with the fight for Indian independence in India, and why she came back and Bamba didn't. And I wondered why she didn't channel her sort of spirit into that cause.
India wasn't her country. It really wasn't her country. It is kind of that immigrant feeling that I think we still have today. If you're born somewhere, she was born, let's not forget, she was born in Belgravia and she lived in Suffolk, and then via Brighton back to central London and this sort of celebrity lifestyle where she is fated by everybody who matters in London. She does not feel Indian. But then after going to India and seeing the way the British treat the Indians, she no longer can feel in all conscience British. Do
you think she ever felt that Britain was her home by the end?
I think she had a really complicated relationship to Britain, but also to India. The notion of home. I think by the end, she falls down again. Then she's sort of like dispossessed by Britain. But what about India? She lives to see partition. She lives to see Punjab in particular ripped apart, rivers of blood, the biggest exodus of humanity, I think even to this day, the crossing over the lines of partitioned Punjab.
You know, suffragette sort of struggle that we haven't really read about very much, you know.
No,
I don't think so. No. I don't know where, you know, did you research that particular area?
I mean, I knew a bit because being, you know, sort of being a political journalist and having called myself a feminist for as long as I have, and I am, I'm a very proud feminist. I knew that it was hard, but actually going into the testimony of women who described what was done to them, and then the recourse, and also Sophia was there. Sophia, so on Black Friday, that episode that I keep alluding to, she's penned up against St. Stephen's Gate. If you know Westminster, it used to be sort of the main entrance, and there's a police line in front of them, and they see these contingents of women arriving at 5-minute intervals because they can't all come together because they're breaking public order laws at that time. So they have to come in small groups. And after Emmeline and her rock stars have arrived and they're penned up against the gate, they have to stand there and watch hour after hour as their friends, their comrades are having their hair pulled, being slapped, being thrown on the ground, and they won't give up. They won't stay down.
She had a special place in all of this because she was basically immune. The government seemed too scared to arrest her, to imprison her. So that put her in an odd place, didn't it?
Because she really, more than anything, she wanted to go on hunger strike. You know, she was a real publicity grenade, and Emmeline and the suffragettes knew it. So they employed her in really obvious ways. There were these fantastic things called press carts, which used to drive through London, and the suffragettes would drive them to the most aggro places they could find. So Drury Lane, for example, they'd park up this press cart and they would be harangued by the men coming out of the theatres in Drury Lane, and they would argue and heckle. Now, not only did Sophia go and sell the newspaper, she drove the carts. So you have these wonderful pictures, which are in the book, of her driving these carts, dressed in the finest high fashion, you know, driving these carts. And she knew, and they knew, the value of having her sent to prison. But every time she was arrested, they let her go. Because can you imagine, Queen Victoria's goddaughter is starving herself to death. They just couldn't. But more than that, that's embarrassing and awful enough, prompting King George V, when he came to the throne, to say, can we not get her out of Hampton Court? But that was bad enough. But what they really didn't want, again, the Raj, they did not want the North to have their warrior princess. And the British tried and actually were very successful in erasing and excising this woman from history. So she was punished, not in the way that her sister suffragettes were necessarily, but she was punished by being deleted.